This is Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change, and I'm your host, Joshua Sparrow at the Brazelton Touchpoint Center. To find out more about the Brazelton Touchpoint Center and Learning to Listen, just go to brazeltontouchpoints.org and click on Learn with Us, and look for Learning to Listen in the Conversations section. There's also a link there to our archive of Learning to Listen conversations over the years. To learn more about and register for more Brazelton Touchpoint Center conversations, events, and trainings, click on the link in the chat. To join the Brazelton Touchpoint Center's Learning Network, look for that link in the chat. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will be learning with Dr. Sandro Galea, physician, epidemiologist, and dean of the Boston University School of Public Health, about what we can learn from the pandemic and its revelations of the conditions in which we live, work, and play, so that we can create both a better world and better health for everyone. But first, a bit of information about today's Learning to Listen episode. Nearly 700 of us have registered for today's webinar, so please do feel free to tell us about you, where you're from, and what you do in the chat. We can see lots of you there already from all over the country. Today, our superb interpreter, Maria Jose Gutierrez, joining us from Bogota, Colombia, will be simultaneously translating our webinar into Spanish. Thank you, Maria Jose. To access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls, then select Spanish. To mute the English in the background, select Mute Original Audio. La conversación de hoy será en español e inglés. En los controles de su reunión, haga clic en Interpretación, haga clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Para escuchar solo español, haga clic en Silenciar audio original. To turn on closed captioning, just click on the closed caption icon in your Zoom controls and select Show Subtitle. You can adjust the size of the subtitles. Please use the chat feature if you have a comment to share or need help with a technical issue, and please put your questions for Dr. Sandro Galea in the question and answer box. We do very much want to hear from you. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, please be sure you complete the feedback survey. That survey will open in your web browser when this webinar ends, and you'll also receive a link to the survey tomorrow in our thank you email from us to you. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors, the Burke Foundation, Cambridge Trust, and Berkshire Bank, and our Brazelton Touchpoint Center production team, Isabella Mantilla, Michael Accardi, and Susan Okasik. And now, it's time to introduce today's guest, Dr. Sandro Galea. Sandro Galea, a physician, epidemiologist, and author, is the Dean and Robert A. Knox Professor at Boston University School of Public Health. He previously held academic and leadership positions at Columbia University, the University of Michigan, and the New York Academy of Medicine. He has published extensively in the peer-reviewed literature and is a regular contributor to a range of public media about the social causes of health, mental health, and the consequences of trauma. He has been listed as one of the most widely cited scholars in the social sciences. He is the current chair of the Boston Public Health Commission Board of Health, past chair of the board of the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health, and past president of the Society for Epidemiologic Research and of the Interdisciplinary Association for Population Health Science. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. Dr. Galea has received several Lifetime Achievement Awards. Dr. Galea, thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled and honored to have you with us. And we thought we'd start with you and with what you would like us to know about you, about why you do the work you do, what in your work gives you your sense of purpose and mattering, and what you'd like us to know about how you came to the work that you are so profoundly passionate about.
Well, first of all, Dr. Sparrow, thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you to everybody who is part of this conversation. It's a privilege to be here with you all. The question is how far back do I go? I'll start from the very beginning. I was born and raised in Malta, which is a small island in the Mediterranean between southern Italy and North Africa. And when you're born and raised in a small island, as I was, and you have any interest in health, you're channeled very quickly into becoming a doctor. I left Malta just before college to go to college, and I always had in mind I wanted to become a doctor to treat sick people. And I did that, and I learned medicine, trained in medicine, did residency, and I have training in primary care and acute care medicine. And then I was working in medicine in some pretty remote parts of the world. I spent some time working in Somalia and Papua New Guinea, in far north of Canada. And as I was in these places where my medical training was quite in use, and my medical training was actually, I think, doing a lot of good, I really became fundamentally dissatisfied with the limitations of that same training because I realized that I was healing people. People were coming, they were sick. I was doing what I was trained to do to make them better, but I was doing nothing to help people not get sick to begin with. And I thought, surely that's a higher calling in some respects. Surely there must be a better way. And I didn't know anything about any of that. So I actually immigrated to this country to go back to graduate school. And I was pretty old to start graduate school. I was 30 at the time. Came back to do a master's and a PhD in public health and epidemiology. And that then started me on this career of academic public health. And my focus has consistently been on trying to understand the forces that keep people healthy. And a lot of my work has been around trauma and stressors. I've been interested in for a long time in traumatic events people experience from childhood all the way through adulthood, individual trauma, as well as trauma experienced by whole groups. And I've also been very much interested in mental health and well-being in a holistic sense of people's health. So I moved from a physician curing people, treating people, and to public health, and with a focus on some of these forces in the world around us, some of these forces of trauma, some of these forces of stress that affect health and that keep people unhealthy. And I've seen my science and scholarship and my public writing and my all my engagements as being concerned with how do we understand what generates health so that we can create a healthier world. So that I think that's roughly my journey, which is why I'm such a fan of organizations like Brazelton and the work that you all do, because you are very much in the space, obviously from early childhood, of creating the conditions that make people healthy. And I really admire that.
I just love that you, after all of your medical training, decided you wanted to figure out how to keep people from getting sick in the first place. And it actually reminds me of what Barry Brazelton always used to say about his pediatric residency training. When he concluded, I sure knew a lot about disease, but I don't know anything about children. And so you came out of your training knowing a lot about how to make people who were sick well, but didn't know how to keep people from getting sick in the first place. And I hope you'll talk to us more about what you've been learning and thinking about what those forces are that can keep people well.
Well, I think to build on Dr. Brazelton's aphorism, I think I felt like I knew a lot about disease, but I knew nothing about health, and and I reasoned that I was much more interested in being healthy rather than being cured from disease, and surely so must everybody else. So I I came of age and academically, I mean, sort of around the turn of the century, about 25 years ago. And at the time, there was a real explosion of interest, I think, and awareness that disease is not just the product of individual biology and genes, not just the product of individual behaviors, not just about whether I smoke, whether I drink, whether I have sexual activity that exposes me to disease, but about the conditions in which I live, about my friends, my networks, my influences throughout childhood that carry with me throughout adulthood, about where I live, about the air I breathe, the water I drink, about the policies that determine air and water and food. And that full set of forces, which one can think of as different levels of influence. I'm a level, the world around me, my friends are a level, the neighborhood around me is another level, policies are another level. So these different levels of influence became a real focus of my work. And as I said, I've come to be really interested, and I've always been interested in trauma and stress as a mediator about how do those elements of living get under your skin, so to speak? How do they become disease? And there are any number of examples of this. And just to be concrete, for example, policies that have been in the way of minority groups in this country, particularly African Americans, of owning homes 100 years ago, which typically now today we call things like redlining, resulted in a century of less wealth accumulation by Black Americans, which results in today in Black American families having substantially fewer assets than white American families by way of comparison. And that translates into having fewer assets, less access to these conditions of a healthy life, and a lot of the gaps in life expectancy, difference in burden of disease that we see between Black Americans and white Americans, but Americans with more assets, with Americans with fewer assets, Americans with less education, with more education. So we can trace connections between policies and systems and structures that create different access to assets that promote health to health today. And when you realize that as a clinician, if you're a physician or a nurse or a social worker, if you're seeing a patient, I'm using the word patient intentionally, because of course a patient is a person, and we tend to think of them as a sick person, hence a patient. And you say, I am concerned with that patient's illness today. That's fine, because that's your job as a clinician. But that illness today is a product of that person's friend group, their behaviors because of their friend group, where they live, the policies that determine where they live, and all of those forces over their lifetime, as well as their parents and their grandparents' lifetime. When you realize that the creation of health requires paying attention to the world around us, the policies that shape health, our history, and the structures within which we live.
I am so glad that you mentioned what are also referred to as the social determinants of health and gave us the example of the inequity in the accumulation of wealth, in part because of the obstruction to acquiring housing, and then that interference with the accumulation of wealth intergenerationally for Black people in this country. In fact, we had Professor Shonita Sealy-Jefferson do a conversation with us back this last spring, who's looked at the correlation between housing insecurity and evictions and maternal and infant morbidity and mortality. So we are right there with you. We'll come back later in the conversation to economic, political, social, and commercial determinants of health. Before we do that, we'll talk about how about a specific example of larger events getting underneath our skin and making us not well, focusing on the pandemic. But before we do that, I was hoping you could talk with us a little bit about the healthiest goldfish. That's something you've been working on for a while. I'd love to hear where you came up with that title, which you probably explained somewhere early on. We'll put a link into the chat so people can find all of those archive blogs. But tell us about what it is, why you call it the healthiest goldfish, what you've been hoping to accomplish with it, and then we'll go talk to the pandemic that got under the skin of most folks worldwide.
Yeah, so the healthiest goldfish is, I guess at a simple level, it's a blog. It is a blog that I publish on Substack every week, couple of weeks. And it started during the pandemic. It started in, I think, 2021 as an outlet for, I wanted an outlet where I could write longer form essays, blogs. They're usually about 1,000, 1,500 words about issues of topical consequence for health. To be completely frank, much of the motivation for the healthiest goldfish was a dissatisfaction with the state of typical social media, where I began to feel like it was becoming really impossible to convey complex ideas using social media tools. And I really wanted to be able to engage with the world in a way that I could work through ideas. The name of the blog, The Healthiest Goldfish, refers to a metaphor. And the metaphor is which in part is influenced by a story by David Foster Wallace, but leaving that aside, yeah, the metaphor is you can have a goldfish living in a bowl, and you can make sure your goldfish swims and exercises. You can make sure it eats healthy food, and you can make sure that it has a goldfish doctor to look after it when it's sick. But the goldfish is still going to die unless you change the goldfish's water. So the metaphor is that I'm concerned with, what I'm interested in is in the goldfish's water. I'm interested in understanding the forces around us that make us well, which, going back to what I said a couple of minutes ago, right? It's not just my behavior, but the world around me, clean air, drinkable water, literally, metaphorically, the policies, the structures, the systems within which I live. Those are all the goldfish's water. So the metaphor is we want to create the healthiest goldfish, which means we want to create the best possible water. And what I've been trying to do is, through that medium, is to write pieces that encourage us to reimagine how we think about health, encourage us to focus on issues that I think matter to health. And I reflect on ongoing current events, but also on ideas that I think we should be thinking about health. For example, the last week and this week, I did a two-part piece, which is around encouraging us to second guess and to think carefully about what we say and do, recognizing that historically, there are many times when things that we've said turn out to be wrong, and encouraging us to have the humility to explore what we think we know in health with caution so that we maintain people's trust. So this piece came out of a engagement with this issue of trust in health, which lately has been a big part of the conversation. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. And I'm trying to inject ideas which hopefully shift how we think about these matters. So that's what been my healthiest goldfish. It's been, so now it's been about a 4-year-long project, and I'll keep doing it for a while. I've been enjoying doing it. I've been enjoying the people's reaction to the pieces. And what I'm trying to achieve, you asked me what I'm trying to achieve. It's very hard to know what one's trying to achieve with any such thing is, I'm just trying to achieve conversation. I'm trying to achieve a shifting in how people think. That's all.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about those pieces is that you really authentically welcome disagreement. And you're really trying to create a conversation where you're welcoming all kinds of diverse points of views. And you approach that with this humility, knowing that you could be wrong, we could be wrong, science could be wrong, that you are linking to how we sustain trust. And I've been concerned for a long time that folks have been using science for credibility without being able to help people understand that science is really an enterprise of testing hypotheses and getting things wrong, and that in getting paradigms that work for a while until they don't work anymore. But it is not all that often about getting it absolutely right forever. I also think your point about the healthiest goldfish on Substack being a place where you could present balance and nuance is really, I think, a central part of what you're trying to do in your work that is so missing. And there's a kind of, I think, honoring and respect you have for your readers and for people who are joining us today, to be able to share and invite the nuance and the complexity, which is missing. So let's go now to the pandemic, which is one instance of where you've done a lot of thinking about how the ways in which we represent science has interfered with public trust in institutions that would benefit from being based on it. And I did want to mention that you've already written 2 books about the pandemic, one called The Turning Point that you wrote with your co-author, Michael Stein, and then you wrote another within reason that actually grew out of your writing in your Healthiest Goldfish blog. So maybe to not sort of go back through all of those horrible years, if we can focus perhaps on what you think the harmful consequences were of the pandemic that we're still affected by today. And spoiler alert, that may get us to the later part of this conversation about our current political environment. But let's start with where are we now after having lived together through the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a very, very long question. I think that will, Josh, that will keep you and I here for the next several hours.
I'm going to read your blog too.
Yeah, the pandemic. Look, the pandemic was an enormous tragedy, right? Probably 7.5 million people worldwide died from the pandemic. 1.2, 1.3 million people in the US died during the pandemic. These are probably underestimates. For 2 years, 2020, 2021, the death from COVID became the third leading cause of death in this country after heart disease and cancer. A disease that came out of nowhere, did not exist until the end of 2019, but 2020 becomes the third leading cause of death. That's extraordinary. Has never happened in any of our lifetimes. Anybody who's involved in this conversation right now. And so a lot of people lost their lives prematurely. A lot of families are still mourning the deaths of loved ones. And I think fundamentally, we need to start a conversation about the pandemic by recognizing the tragic impact it had on human life. That's number one. Number two, there are also the longer term physical consequences of the pandemic, which typically go by the name of long COVID. It's a term that refers to a specific constellation of physical symptoms, but there are other consequences of COVID, including mental health consequences, particularly depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, that in a not insubstantial part of the population have gone on for years and continue to this day. So I start with acknowledging death and then acknowledging morbidity, sickness that is directly linked to COVID that lingers to this day. Now, let me move to the third set of consequences. I think the third set of consequences are social and economic consequences. During COVID itself, there were extraordinary social consequences in terms of the efforts that we took to restrict the spread of this terrifying infectious disease that resulted in the lockdowns and in schools not functioning, people not being able to go to their jobs, people losing their job, deepening of economic divides, deepening of health divides. These were truly disruptive social consequences in 2020, 2021 in particular. Really, we haven't recovered fully from that. We'll get to the election in a second, but the election was in many respects a reflection of the COVID years, but we'll get to that. So this was again, in the lives of everybody in this room, this was an unprecedented disruption. We had never lived through something like this that came out of nowhere and disrupted lives like that. Just use one concrete example. We had a extraordinary rise in use of drugs and deaths from drugs, drug overdoses. And in 2020, 21, 22, I'll give you a data point, which we seldom think about. Under the age of 65, more people died from drug overdose than died from COVID. And that is an extraordinary data point. That just shows the disruptions that were wrought by COVID. Part of those disruptions, not to continue about the long-term consequences, were how COVID intersected with public health, how it intersected with experts, with science, and with how it intersected with how we stated what we knew and the extent to which the public trusted what we said. In many respects, COVID was a triumph of public health because millions of lives were lost, but many, many more millions were saved through vaccines and through efforts at testing, early detection, screening, isolation, contact tracing. So public health was highly effective during COVID, but we emerged from the pandemic with loss of trust in health, in public health, and in science. And these are some of the long-term consequences that then push us to say, why is that? Why should that be? And that's what my book, you mentioned book, Within Reason, was about. It was trying to think deeply about the challenge of the COVID moment and trying to think about how does one balance the need to act decisively and quickly on mitigating the spread of a terrifying infectious disease with the social prerogative of allowing lives to continue and recognizing the heterogeneity of influence across the country and across the world. So I unfortunately offer few answers in my book Within Reason. Anybody who reads it, you'll see that I offer more questions than answers. I think I have been challenged and criticized on that reasonably. I think it's a reasonable criticism, actually. But in my defense, I don't offer answers because I don't have easy answers. I actually don't have easy answers. But I try to raise the questions. And people often ask me, what were you trying to achieve with the book Within Reason? And my answer is, I want to make sure that the next time there is a pandemic, these questions are at least on the table. They are part of the conversation. So I'm giving you a long answer to your question, but I do think your question merits a long answer. COVID needs to be thought through in terms of the direct impact on premature lives lost prematurely, direct impact on people's health and long-term health and disability, and the impact on social and economic disruption, which of course has its own indirect consequence on health, and its impact on trust, credibility, position of science and public health, and how and what implications that has for science and public health's capacity to be a force for good going forward.
So you mentioned the disruption, both social and economic disruptions, especially during the first 2 years, and some of us may prefer to forget when it looked like the whole bottom was falling out of the economy and so many jobs were lost. But you've written also, even going back to your work on the 9/11 traumatic event, about the ways in which social and economic forces can magnify or amplify or aggravate in some ways the way in which a society experiences traumatic events like that. So in the case of the pandemic, maybe you can talk with us about the kinds of social and economic forces that made things even harder for people.
Yeah, so now I would go back to my first book about the pandemic. You said correctly, there were two books. The first one was called The Contagion Next Time. And The Contagion Next Time, which I published in 2022, I believe, was a book that really answered this exact question, Josh. It was about what are the social and economic conditions, social and economic forces that predispose people to do the way they did during COVID. My argument in that book was that COVID affected, and it's a US-centric book. I don't talk about the world. There's a lot to be said about COVID and the rest of the world, but I was focused on the US. That COVID found us, and the first line of the book is, we were sitting ducks. And the point I make is that Americans were less healthy than they should have been. COVID affected people who were unhealthy much more than people who were healthy. And we had disinvested from our systems that could protect us, public health systems, systems of surveillance, testing. And we had deep divides in the state of health in this country, that people with fewer assets, who were marginalized, had marginalized identities and marginalized communities, had poorer health, less access to the resources that generate health. And all of that was a recipe for two things. Number one is high rates of COVID, higher than any other high-income country, a slower ability to respond to COVID, and a widening of health gaps, with the consequence of COVID being felt much more on groups that were already marginalized and that had fewer assets to protect themselves. That was that's essentially the whole book, The Contagion Next Time. That's what the book talks about. And I think what it does, when you realize, if you buy that argument that I'm making, you realize that the consequences of something like COVID are predetermined by the social and economic conditions before COVID ever hits. So the point I make in The Contagion Next Time is that it wasn't about the virus. Now, obviously, it was about the virus. The virus was the acute stressor, but it was the underlying social economic conditions. It was underlying health, underlying investment in the structures that could help us. It was the underlying health gaps that essentially pre-wrote the book of what was going to happen in COVID. And that, to my mind, is both tragic, but also deeply instructive, that we can and we should do better, because we know what will happen if another pandemic happens.
One of the examples that you give in your work is the distinction between people who were deemed essential workers, who stayed in their jobs facing the public, interacting with other people at higher risk of infection, and those who were able to move their work remotely, who as a result were at lower risk of being infected. And that distinction between essential workers and people who could do their work remotely also occurred along a class fault line, right? That I think you've talked about sort of reinforcing a kind of polarization that may still be with us now. So tell me if I have that right, or
No, you very much do. And the when COVID hit, I'm trying to think of how to answer that, but let me try to answer that with a concrete example. So COVID hits, and in March 16th of 2020, the president declares a national emergency declaration. It was a terrifying new infectious disease. We didn't know what it was. We knew it was transmitted person to person. The president says, stay home. If you can stay home, right? So we did that. Well, when I say we did that, it was those of us who could stay home, who stayed home. The majority of Americans, the majority of working Americans, in fact, about 75% of working Americans, who are, by the way, the 75% lower earning Americans, don't have the luxury of working from home. So when you say stay home if you can, what you're also saying is you're differentially protecting people who have higher income, a minority of people, and you're exposing those who are lower income. So now you are tapping into already a socioeconomic divide, and you are deepening the divide because you are exposing people who make less money already to greater risk. And that's exactly what happened, by the way. In the first year of COVID, disproportionately, people in manufacturing jobs, people in transportation jobs, people who were in care of the elderly, those are the people who died more in the context of COVID. And so just that very simple action, which is a national emergency declaration that says if you can work from home, stay home, that takes underlying economic divides and translates them into greater health divides. So, when I say this, I'm often asked, well, what should we have done? Should we not have done that work from home if you can? And the answer to that is very complicated because it was a rapidly moving disease. It was a very confusing and difficult time. But I do think it's fair to say that there was little public conversation about what the consequences of those actions were going to be. So I'm trying to document these ideas now in the hope that they influence our behavior in future.
And so that explanation also, I think, helps us look at where we are now with this ever more polarized country, and where some of the polarization is also separating those who earn less from the smaller group who earn more. So I'm wondering what you think we all need now to recover health, given these persistent effects that are still with us today of the pandemic.
Yeah, I suppose I have two answers to that. I would again divide what we mean by the consequences. I think we need to make sure that people who have the long-term physical consequences have the health that they need. And by the way, by physical, I include mental health. I think there's no division between mental health and physical. By physical, I mean symptomatological manifestation of the COVID disease itself, be that through the fatigue and other symptoms that accompany long COVID, or be that through the symptoms of anhedonia, unhappiness, or that characterize depression. So I think number one, we need to make sure that people who have these consequences have the care that they need. Number two, I think we need to learn, and I think we need to reconceive how we prepare ourselves for future events. And remember, I said there were three main axes on which this affected us: the axis of gaps in our health, the axis of us being unhealthier to begin with, and the axis of having underinvested in the public health infrastructure that could protect us. Those three things should be our motivation. We should be focusing on dealing with narrowing health gaps, making us as a society healthier than we currently are, and making sure that we invest in the public health infrastructure that can protect us in future.
So that brings us back to the water in the goldfish bowl, right?
It does.
And
It all comes back to the water in the goldfish bowl.
yeah. And as you were just talking about these sort of concentric circles around the individual, I was reminded of the ecological framework for development that a colleague of Barry Brazelton's put forward, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, back in the 1970s. And it really was very much this model of concentric circles, which come together to be the water in the goldfish bowl. So if we now look at the economic, political, social determinants of health, which is another way of thinking about, what is influencing what's in the water. Let's add to that something that you recently edited a book on, which is not yet, I think, as common a term, which is the commercial determinants of health. So if we look at the economic, political, social, and commercial determinants of health as being what's going to affect the water that we are all swimming in, tell us what you think is going to happen in the current political environment in the next 4 years, where you think there are opportunities to learn, to where you think there are opportunities to protect and defend, what you're worried about, and where, despite it all, there may be some hope in terms of what we can all do to try to make the water that we're swimming in healthy. That's a big question, but we got time.
Yeah. No, I of course know exactly what's going to happen in the next 4 years, and I can map it out for all of us. I think just to start with that part of the question, I think it's the easiest part of the question to answer because the answer is very brief, which is we don't know. I think we're entering a period of political upheaval, led by a president, and I really want to be careful. I'm never partisan in my comments. I don't mean at all. I think it's a president we've had before, who we know has a non-linear style of governing. So I think it's actually very hard to predict the correlation between the statements made while campaigning with what will actually happen during governing. So I think it's very hard to know what's going to happen next 4 years as a result. I think a typical presidential transition would have much more of a linearity to it, in that there is a platform which then a candidate tends to follow. So I think we really don't know what will happen next 4 years. But let me now ground that in your larger question, which is about the commercial determinants of health. The commercial determinants of health agenda really is predicated on a very simple observation, is that if you're thinking about the goldfish water, to go back to the water around us is shaped not just by the public sector, it's shaped also by the private sector. In fact, most of us work for the private sector. The majority of Americans work for the private sector. And most of the products that we touch are generated by the private sector. I'm speaking to you on my computer. We are using Zoom as a way of communicating. We're wearing clothing that's manufactured by the private sector. I look around at your office behind you. Everything there comes from commercial forces, right? Those commercial forces influence the air around us. They influence the houses within which we live. They influence the products, some of them harmful, some of them healthy, that we make use of. They influence the quality of the air. They influence the food that we eat. So what commercial determinants of health agenda does is it says, how do we understand commercial forces so that we can understand how they generate health to a very simple end, which is to maximize the good and minimize the bad? How do we understand how commercial forces act so that we can intervene and encourage action that is positive for health rather than negative for health? I think my fundamental assumption in the commercial determinants agenda is always this, is that my colleagues and friends, and I suspect your colleagues and friends who work in the private sector, all things being equal, would rather do good than not do good. So how can we illuminate what are the steps that the private commercial actors can take that generate health? How can we point the way to saying this way doesn't compromise commercial success and generates product and conditions within which we live that create health? In the coming back to the next 4 years, which was part of your sort of your braid of a question, one can reasonably expect that there will be greater prominence of commercial actions over public actions. That's simply consistent with where the Republican Party has long been. And so I think it's an important time to actually think about commercial forces and how they affect health.
So when you talk about opportunities to point the way, part of that would depend on trust in science, which you've indicated has been really severely eroded. And I'm guessing some of that would actually depend on some sort of consensus that regulation has a role in terms of pointing commercial determinants in a healthier direction. And again, not that you necessarily have to have answers to these really hard questions, but in your work, are you seeing hopeful opportunities where science is being used, where trust is being restored, or where there is a case to be made for the role of regulation in positively shaping the direction of commercial determinants that you can see us attempting to amplify?
Yeah, I'm always hopeful because I think hope is much better than the alternative. So for anybody who has been listening to this and who just signed up to Healthiest Goldfish, you can actually go back 2 weeks and I wrote a piece about the case for hope and optimism, even in time of political upheaval. And I see examples of this all the time. In fact, just last week, a survey, the sort of the Pew Charitable Trust, which does the most credible surveys on trust, showed that there's been a bit of a reversal of the decrements to trust that we've seen over the past 3 years for the first time in 3 years. So I am hopeful. And I actually think that there is such a rise in interest in the forces that create well-being and that nurture a healthier life, particularly among the younger generation, that I think there is a commercial imperative to engage in that conversation, to create healthier products. Now, some of it, we have to be careful. Some of it is cynically used, and some of it is simply to use a casual term, a marketing gimmick. One would hope that everybody engaged in this webinar is sophisticated enough to see through that. But I do think there is a genuine desire on the part of a younger generation for products and approaches by commercial partners that actually are genuinely health promoting. So I think that is a really good thing.
Are there specific areas of the nation's health that you are concerned about that you think will require more protection, more attention? You've talked specifically about depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. Are those, or are there other specific?
Yeah, well, I think about 70% of disease burden in this country and worldwide is from what we call non-communicable disease. These are like hypertension, links to obesity and unhealthy body weight, resultant cardiovascular disease. These are the burden of disease on those fronts, which is a lot of it which is mediated through unhealthy diets, through challenges with exercise, not having opportunity to have the proper engagement with healthy lifestyles. All of that represents an enormous opportunity for to prevent disease. And I think we, as a society, need to have the political will to make health a priority. That is what I think all of us who are in the space of generating ideas on health, which I think Brazelton is in the business of as well, apart from many other things, which is why you're doing this podcast, have a responsibility to push forward the creation of such political will.
Well, I appreciate your including us as fellow travelers there. You mentioned that in your blog from I think about 2 weeks ago, you were making the case for hope. And this is a hard but important time to do that. And I'd actually excerpted a quote from that piece that I wanted to read to have you react to say more about the case for hope, particularly in this moment in time. You wrote with your colleague, Dr. Nason Mani, Martin Luther King, in his address to Cornell College in 1962, argued that extreme pessimists and extreme optimists agree on one point, that the best thing to do when faced with challenges is to sit down and do nothing. Dr. King argued rather for a realist view, that is, a perspective that suggests that we cannot ignore where progress has been made, acknowledging hope, but doing so while also being mindful of the immense challenges one may face and acknowledging despair. However, a strong theme to his writing was that not acting is simply not an option. In particular, when there may be a sense that the wider systems around us might have capacity to inflict suffering, we must match that by our capacity to endure and to create a better world. So tell us what that better world looks like to you and where you see hope.
Mm. Yeah, I love that quote. I actually, what I really like about the quote is that it it calls the conceit that I think we often have, which is to say pessimism bad or good, depending on your perspective, optimism bad or good, depending on your perspective. And it actually says it really is at the extremes of both, which we should avoid, right? Because extreme pessimism, extreme optimism, both essentially make you say, there's nothing I should do. If you're extreme pessimist, you're like, well, there's nothing I can do, it's all bad. If you're extreme optimist, you say, I don't need to do anything, it's all going to be fine. And the world is much more messy, much more complicated than that. And it calls for a pragmatic approach. Dr. King called it a realist approach. I have used the term pragmatic, which means an approach grounded in the real world that is optimistic in the sense that it believes that things can get better, but it's hopeful in the sense that it pushes us to action to make things better, recognizing that things do not get better of themselves. They actually become better through the actions of good people. What are we trying to achieve? We are trying to achieve a radical vision of a healthier world. What does that look like? It is a world where you do not have a differential likelihood of living to a certain age based simply on the color of your skin or your good fortune of where you were born or the amount of money your parents happen to have in their savings account, where everybody has the opportunity to live rich, long, fulfilled, healthy lives. A world where everybody has lives, years of lives saved from diseases we can prevent. Being pragmatic, being realistic, there's a set of diseases, a set of conditions that defeat us, that we still do not know, that we actually don't know what causes them. And that's fine, that's the human nature. I see somebody in Marisol Flores put a note in the chat. We can't give up working for a better world. We can also move the bar forward and celebrate the small wins. And, I have called that, what Marisol just wrote, radical incrementalism. And what I mean by that is we should have a radical vision of a world which is healthy for all, a world where everybody can live rich, full lives, where they can self-actualize and do what they want to do. But being pragmatic enough to realize that to get there, it requires the hard incremental work of rolling up our sleeves and saying, what are the steps we need to get there? What are the steps we need to get to make sure that everybody has a livable wage? What are the steps we need to make sure that we all live in air that's not polluted? 7 million people worldwide probably die from air pollution every year. What are the steps it takes to get there? We know that if you have more education versus less education, you're probably increasing your life expectancy by 10 to 20 years. How do we make sure that everybody is as educated as much as possible? How do we create those structures that scaffold the achievement of good health? And it takes time. We know it takes time, but that's okay because it is a worthwhile mission towards this radical vision of the world.
And in your vision of a healthier world, equitable access to health and longevity is really central. You read Marisol Flores' comment in the chat. She also has a question for you. Do you believe that if US healthcare does not move away from a business model, that the US will continue to stay sick, as this is a for-profit of multiple sectors such as insurance and pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, I've actually written on, and I'll put it in the chat in a second, a piece about how health systems are. This is not in Goldfish, this is an academic journal. We can think of health systems as commercial actors because health systems in this country do have the same commercial imperatives as do other for-profit industries. And I've done that not to despair, perhaps as a theme in all this conversation. I try not to despair, but to illustrate the pathways through which health systems actually act the way they do, through which health systems affect health and through which we can improve how health systems operate. So I'm not sure I'm willing to say that we cannot achieve better health if we move away from a corporate actions of health systems. I'm not sure I'm willing to say that, but I am willing to say that recognizing the commercial motivations of health systems should push us to work with health systems and to nudge them in a way that acts in a pro-health manner.
That sounds like an incremental, pragmatist approach, because even if you thought that we would have to move away from healthcare as a business, that's not going to happen tomorrow morning. Right. So the nudging is, may or may not get us closer or further away from a model other than a business profit bottom line kind of approach. I'm thinking, part of what you said, you love that quote from Martin Luther King that you and your co-author wrote in your blog. Part of what I think is important about the quote and important about your work is this attempt to speak to both sides at the same time, acknowledging despair while holding on to hope. And that's a hard thing for people to do, and it's a hard thing to communicate in the oversaturated social media world where you have too little time. And before you've gotten to the other side of this complex, nuanced argument, people have gone on to the next thing, to doom scroll. And so I think that's one of the hallmarks of the way you think, is sort of honoring us with our potential to be able to think with these nuances and to hold on to these things that seem like they're in opposition to each other, but they aren't really. They're really nuances that we need to hold together. The other thing that you said was we need to roll up our sleeves. And so I thought, as you were saying that, you're rolling up your sleeves and packing your bags and going to St. Louis, Missouri, to, I think, open a new school of public health at Washington University. And I think you've written that part of it is actually about getting away from the coasts where we are in sort of an ideological bubble, to be in a place where you can learn and be connected to people whose experiences and ways of thinking about things are very different. So I want to give you a chance to tell us a little bit about why you're leaving us here on the East Coast and what you're hoping to accomplish there, and then to leave us all with what you think we can do as we roll up our sleeves too.
Yeah, but by the way, I put in the chat the link to the paper about thinking of health systems as commercial determinants of health for people. I've been in this country for 25 years, and 20 of those 25 years have been on the East Coast between Boston and New York. Spent 10 years in Boston most recently, and I spent 10 years in New York before then. And I have I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the coast. I really have my children were born here, and they sort of see this as home. And in many respects, it's been my adopted adult home after my sort of my wandering childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. And but the more time passed, the more I realized that I see the world in a very particular way. I try to be aware of my biases. Really, I write about biases, try to be aware of it. But even then, it's hard for me to see the world the way, let's say, half the country sees the world, despite my best effort. And when this opportunity presented itself at Washington University to be part of this exciting, interesting project of actually building a school of public health in the state of Missouri that serves the country and the world, certainly, but has a strong local focus in a state. Missouri is sort of Midwest/South, where the world is seen differently by the majority of people in the state. And I thought it was an important moment to take the opportunity to learn, to be a part of a different way of looking at things, to round out my understanding, to help move me forward in my own intellectual evolution. So I'm not exactly sure what that means, to be honest. I'm not exactly sure where that leads me, but I'm looking forward to it. With always bittersweet with these things. I leave behind a school and a city I care about very much, and I will continue to be involved and supportive and encouraging of all the good work that's happening here. But I'm hoping to challenge myself in a different way, and I am looking forward to seeing what I will learn in so doing.
You are walking that walk that I think we talked about at the beginning, which is really welcoming disagreement and diversity of perspectives. And that's why we call this series Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change. We are so honored to have had you with us, and we'd love to have you back again after you've spent some time in your new home to hear what you've been listening to and where it is taking you. So thank you so much for joining us today and bringing to us your work with its balance and nuance and the hope that sometimes it feels like even against all odds, you are really committed to holding on to. And thank you for your leadership and your vision. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today for all you do. And I hope you'll come back on January 29th when Harvard Graduate School of Education professor Junlei Lee will come back again. He joined us, I think, in our very first spring Learning to Listen in 2019, and he'll talk with us about his take on early relational health.
Oh, Dr. Sparrow, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed being here, and I would be honored to come back anytime.
That'd be great. And we have friends we have to introduce you to in St. Louis.
I would look forward to that.